The NFL draft has come and gone, and with it the first draft in the Bill O'Brien era for the Houston Texans. So how did they do? How did they attack the draft, and were they successful in addressing their needs? Well, number one, I think they attacked the draft in the perfect manner. You look at the last two Super Bowl winners, the Baltimore Ravens and the Seattle Seahawks. They have done it without necessarily needing to have elite quarterbacks. Granted, Joe Flacco was no slouch in the playoffs that season, throwing 11 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, and Russell Wilson last year was also a very good quarterback. But neither of those guys were paid a whole lot. They were not the focal point of their teams. Both teams focused on good running games as well as very good defenses, and it looks like the Texans tried to make a team like that, built from the inside out with their draft. Of course, it started out at the top with Jadeveon Clowney, the defensive end out of South Carolina. It was the easiest pick. You take a guy like Clowney, even if he isn't necessarily the quote-unquote perfect fit for your system, because, let's face it, Clowney is so good, and he is so talented, and he is such a once-in-a-generation type of player that you adjust your system to make it fit. You don't pass on him just because you don't think your system is perfect for him. You make your system fit, you make it work, and you turn him into a beast and unleash all of that potential. Next to J.J. Watt, the possibilities are really endless for the Texans on defense. They also supplemented Jet Clowney by picking up Louis Nix III in the third round, trading back up to get the defensive tackle out of Notre Dame. Now, Nix is a guy that the Texans haven't had. That big, large nose tackle that can just eat up space in the middle of their 3-4 line. In the past, they've had kind of agile 3-4 guys play defensive tackle, but they haven't had the guy that will just stop the run, take up multiple blockers, and just eat space. In Louis Nix, they have that. Nix was a little bit of an injury concern coming out of Notre Dame, as well as a guy who didn't seem to play all the time. But if he gets back to what he was when Notre Dame made their run of the title in 2012, then the Texans may very well have gotten themselves a steal in the draft. Nix was a top 50 talent, no doubt about it, but he fell due to those leg injuries and questions about his motor. So if the Texans are able to get Nix to play up to his potential, and that's a very, very, very scary D-line of him surrounded by J.J. Watt and Jadeveon Clowney on the outside. To supplement those two players, they got Xavier Suafilo, an offensive lineman out of UCLA who projects to slot in at one of the guard positions. You saw a lot of pressure last season in Matt Schaub's face. Of course, that was highlighted by the fact that Matt Schaub is a statue in the pocket. But a lot of pressure last season came from up the middle. Dwayne Brown on the outside was one of the best left tackles in the NFL. Right tackle was a huge problem all season, but we're not going to address that. But there's a lot of problem with pressure coming up the middle, from the guard slots and from the center slot. And so with Suafilo on the board, the Texans chose to pass on Derek Carr, the quarterback, and instead address the issues they had at the offensive line. And the way they attacked this draft was perfect. They went from the outside in, they addressed other needs other than quarterback, and got their quarterback later on because they made it clear, the Texans brass did, that they didn't see a huge difference between the top quarterbacks, Johnny Manziel, Teddy Bridgewater, and Blake Bortles, between those guys and the second-tier quarterbacks, your Tom Savages, your Jimmy Garoppolos, your Derek Carrs, guys like that. They didn't see a huge difference between the top tier and the second-tier guys. So they went ahead and they filled out the rest of their roster, plugged in some other holes, including C.J. Federowicz out of Iowa, who's a blocking tight end, so he can come in and allow the Texans to play a little more two tight end sets because he's able to both pass and block, something the Texans haven't had. They've had guys like Owen Daniels and Garrett Graham be successful in the tight end role, but that was simply as receivers, not necessarily as blockers. But Savage is the guy that a lot of people are going to have their eyes on. Is this a guy that the Texans are going to make a project? Is he somebody they're going to give the ball to right away? Chances are he's not, given that he has not been very consistent in college, but Bill O'Brien is known as a QB guru. He's known as a guy that can mold quarterbacks, and Savage has some of the best arm strength in coming in out of this draft. And so if O'Brien really wants to hone his talents as a QB guru, he's got the guy to work with here in Tom Savage. Savage has the the tools, the physical tools, and the size. He just has to put it all together. And if O'Brien can turn him into that quarterback, and they got him at round 4, the Texans may have just dominated this draft. As it stands right now, they addressed a lot of issues, including some in the backfield where they have struggled recently, and they have to make up for the losses of Ben Tate. And in case Arian Foster isn't completely healthy, the Texans really killed this draft. If you want a pick-by-pick recap, go ahead and go to my blog, Sports by Foss. You can find it either at austinfoss.com by going over one tab, or by going to afoss.blogspot.blogspot.com. We're going to come back. We're going to address the NBA playoffs, take a look at a couple stories, not necessarily involving the action on the court. Stay with us. We will be right back. 2 new coaching hires in the NBA this week as Stan Van Gundy has joined the Detroit Pistons as president of basketball operations as well as head coach. And Steve Kerr has made his decision. He is now the head coach of the Golden State Warriors. So how do these affect their teams? We'll start out with Kerr. Kerr was one of the most sought-after names in the coaching free agent market. And the Warriors fired Mark Jackson and figured they would be able to really have their pick of whatever coach they wanted. Didn't really seem that way, as it seemed that the Warriors were getting played by every coach out there, whether it was Steve Kerr or Stan Van Gundy, using the Warriors as leverage to get a better contract. In Kerr's case, it was the Knicks, hoping to get a better contract from the Knicks, and in Stan Van Gundy's case, they were hoping to get a better contract from the Pistons. The Pistons eventually bought in, gave Van Gundy a better contract, gave him more power than the Warriors were willing to allow, and with Kerr, New York surprisingly didn't give the money that Golden State did. Now, what is Kerr walking into in Golden State that he's not walking into in New York? In Golden State, the talent is there. Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Andrew Bogut when healthy, David Lee, Harrison Barnes, Iguodala. It's a very, very good team, but they're also in the ultra-competitive Western Conference, where winning 50 games will get you maybe a 6 or 7 seed. So Kerr is going to go in and he's going to have immediate pressure to perform and immediate pressure to win. Whereas if he had gone to New York, if he gets that team to 45 wins, they get a number 3 or number 4 seed in the horrid Eastern Conference, and Kerr is seen as a savior. In New York, where they are all about their basketball, if he goes in and he's able to turn that team around in a year and just get them back to respectability and get them back to contending for a playoff spot, then Kerr's going to be a rock star. He's going to be seen as a savior. Phil Jackson is going to be seen as the guy who came in and saved New York, because Kerr was Phil's favorite all along. According to multiple reports, Kerr was the favorite of Phil Jackson. Phil had met with Kerr multiple times to discuss the opening, and it didn't work out. Whether it's because of money or whatever, it just did not end up happening. And so now the Knicks are left to scramble with what's left. And the Warriors got themselves a coach that is unknown. Despite being so sought after, he's an unknown commodity. He's never been an assistant coach anywhere. He went from being a very good player under Greg Popovich and other coaches to being a announcer for TNT, going into the GM spot with the Suns, where he really, quite honestly, was not all that great. Then he went back to TNT after the Suns let him go. So now he's going to be the coach of the Golden State Warriors. A lot of pressure will be on him to take that team to the next level after Mark Jackson was fired, even though he had made the postseason in 2 consecutive years. So Kerr is under a lot of pressure after going to the Warriors instead of going to the Knicks. What about Stan Van Gundy? Is he going to be able to turn the Pistons around? The Pistons have spent a lot of money in previous years. They had a team last year that really didn't fit. They had tried to move Josh Smith to the small forward position, even though Josh Smith cannot shoot, but thinks he can, so he shoots from the outside quite often. So they really had 3 bigs on the floor with Josh Smith, Greg Monroe, and Andre Drummond, and as a result their spacing was bad, and their defense wasn't even all that good, because they didn't know who was going to guard who, and so they bring in Van Gundy. He's going to try to develop Drummond, turn Drummond into a player, just as Van Gundy did with Dwight Howard, and developed Howard and turned Howard into the best center in the NBA. Is Drummond ever going to be that good? Maybe. He's got the physical tools, but Van Gundy has some talent to work with. It's a question. There's still some questions of what's going to happen with Greg Monroe. You may see Greg Monroe leave in free agency so that they can move Josh Smith to the 4. But Van Gundy has inherited a little bit of talent there in Detroit, and Detroit's got themselves a heck of a coach. Van Gundy has a very exasperating tone at all times. Seems like he's always out of breath. It seems like it would get a bit annoying as a player, but as a tactician, as a guy who can get his guys in the right spot to perform, there are few better in the NBA than Stan Van Gundy. And the Pistons got themselves a very, very good coach. And if the Pistons end up turning things around and getting themselves into the playoffs next year, it really will not be that much of a surprise, even though it will be Van Gundy's first year at the helm. So those are the two big coaching stories in the NBA. And of course, there's Donald Sterling, who just cannot seem to shut his mouth. We'll go into him at a later time. Well, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Fosscast Episode 3. Come back later. We will address what's going on in the world of sports. The summer is coming, but that does not mean that sports are taking any time off. In fact, they are just beginning to ramp up.